What is going on, Chess YouTube? So in today's video, we're having a look at one of the latest and greatest games played between Daniel Naroditsky, the blitz specialist, and Magnus Carlsen, the GOAT of chess. And this game took place today on January 15, 2025 on the chess.com servers. All right, in the game, Daniel opens 1e4 and Magnus goes 1e6, the French defense. A very interesting choice for this blitz game. Now we have d4 and d5, and now here, of course, White has a million different options in the game. He did go knight to d2. That is the Tarrasch variation. Now we have c5 from Black, counterattacking in the center. Knight g to f3, knight to c6. So far, this is all very, very standard stuff. And here, the main line for White involves taking on d5, e takes d5, and then after e takes, you go bishop b5, exerting pressure on that knight on c6, pitting it to the king on e8, and threatening things like castles, rook e1 check, hitting the king again, and so on. Now, instead of this idea, e takes, then bishop b5, here White goes bishop b5 immediately, again, pinning that knight on c6 to the king on e8, but this turns out to be a little bit dubious, and here's the problem. Black can just go a6, forcing you to take on c6 with the bishop, and that would not be good for White at all. Now, here, instead of a6, that is the strongest move here. Again, pressuring the bishop. Black does go c takes d4, and this lets Daniel off the hook. Here, Daniel does recapture with the knight. Knight takes d4. Then we have bishop d7. And here, of course, White is not forced to take with the bishop. He can take with the knight instead. Of course, that knight on d4 is now hanging, as that knight on c6 is no longer pinned to the king, as the bishop blocks the attack. So here, Daniel, he does go knight takes c6. Black takes back with the b pawn. B takes c6, and then we have bishop d3. And here, we have a very interesting pawn structure. Of course, Black has that famous pawn triangle on c6, d5, and e6 in the spirit of the Caro-Kann, the French defense, and many other openings, the semi-Slav, and so on. But on the other hand, White is going to have very good attacking chances on the king side. Black's king is virtually forced to castle kingside. You really can't go queenside in this pawn structure. But from there, White's ideas like, for example, e5, queen g4, h4, h5, rook h3, rook to g3, and so on, to increase the pressure on the king side. All right, here, it is Magnus Carlsen's turn to move. Here, you do not want to go knight f6. If you do that, then e5 is very, very strong. White gets a huge initiative. Therefore, Black goes bishop d6. That is the best square for the bishop and the best move overall on the chessboard. Now, here, Daniel Naroditsky, he has the option of castling right away. However, he may actually want to go for the alpha zero attack, h4, h5, maybe even rook h3 to g3 later in the game. So instead of castling right away, he does go queen to e2, a very flexible move. Now, very importantly, if Black goes knight f6, then e5 hits both the bishop and the knight. Therefore, knight f6 would be an immediate blunder from Black. So Black will have to find something else to do. What does he want to do, though? Well, there are two main ideas here for Black. One is e5. Getting a firm stake in the center, and the other one is simply knight to e7, abandoning the idea of going knight to f6, and overall, e7 would be a decent square for the knight, and that is what the GOAT, Magnus Carlsen, goes for in the game. So, knight e7 played here, then we have knight to f3, bring the knight over to the f3 square, very solid. And now here again, Magnus has many different options. For example, d takes e4 is playable. You can go c5, gaining space on the queen side, and you can go knight to g6. In the game, knight g6 was played. That is a decent square for the knight. And now, of course, the knight and the queen control the h4 square, which makes h2, h4 a little bit less attractive here. All right, what is Daniel going to do? Well, he starts e5, gaining space in the center. Of course, the knight and the queen do support that pawn on e5. Therefore, Black does not have the option of taking on e5, as he would immediately lose a piece. All right, Magnus, do you want to go bishop e7 or c7? In the game, he does go bishop c7, maintaining the pressure on this pawn on e5. And very importantly, Black's going to have some different ways to pile up more pressure. For example, queen to b8 is one option, tripling up the pressure on that pawn on e5. Now here, Daniel, it turns out the strongest way to proceed is simply short castles. That way, if Black black does go queen b8, you are in time to go rook f to e1, supporting that pawn on e5 and maintaining it. Instead, though, here Daniel does go h4, and keep in mind, this is a blitz game. He's only spent a total of 10 seconds so far for his first 12 moves. Absolutely incredible. But the problem with this move, black is going to have the option of going queen to b8 right here, right now, piling up pressure on that pawn on e5. And if white goes h5, continuing the alpha zero attack, then black does win a pawn on e5 immediately. Therefore, bishop takes g6 would be forced to maintain the pawn, but overall, white would be pretty much done with his attack on the king side. Now, instead of queen b8, that is clearly the strongest move. Here, Magnus goes knight to e7, preemptively retreating his knight, but this turns out to be a very weak move, and here Daniel will get a huge attack on the king side as discussed earlier. All right, now, h5, continuing the alpha zero attack. The point being, he wants to go h6, forcing a ton of weaknesses on the king side. Therefore, Magnus does go h6, stopping the attack. But here, Daniel has the massive space advantage. He doesn't have to castle. He can always go, for example, rook h3, rook g3, king to f1, and so on, sort of getting the artificial attack on the king side. And this is going to be very, very dangerous for Magnus. All right, now here, Daniel, how does he want to proceed? Well, rook h3 or rook h4, intending rook g3 or g4 is very strong, but instead b3 played in the game, with the point being, maybe the bishop wants to go to b2 if it needs to later in the game, and you also set up the idea of c2 to c4, gaining space on the queen side. That could be very important later in the game. And finally, you are preemptively defending the pawn on b2. That way, if black goes rook b8, for example, you don't have pressure on that pawn on b2. So overall, very good, flexible move by Daniel. Now here, Magnus, he goes bishop a5, pressuring the king on e1, a very creative use of that bishop on the c7 square. The bishop going to d6, then c7, and then all the way to a5, again, pressuring the king on e1. Now, Daniel, he blocks the attack. Bishop d2, very solid move. And now here, Magnus, he goes c5, gaining space on the queen side, potentially setting up the idea of knight to c6, bringing the knight over to the c6 square, where it would pressure e5, but at the same time, it would be further away from the defense of the king side. So that would be a very double-edged idea. All right, now in this position, the computer says the best way to proceed, believe it or not, is simply c2 to c3. The point being, if black ever expands on the queen side with, say, c4, then you have c2 and b1 available for that light squared bishop, and it would stay on this diagonal here. That is very, very important. Now, instead, Daniel, this is a blitz game, he goes king to f1, sliding his king off this diagonal, and now the bishop is no longer pinned. Therefore, here, Magnus does take on d2. We have bishop takes d2, then knight takes d2, and now a5, gaining space on the queen side. All right, here, Daniel, how does he want to continue with the attack? Well, it turns out the strongest way to go is just rook to h3, intending rook g3, and again, pressuring g7, sort of forcing something from black. You have to either castle, go rook h7, rook g8, or something else, none of which would be very attractive from black's perspective. Now, instead of rook h3, here Daniel goes queen to g4, and this move turns out to be a little bit dubious. Here Magnus finds the strongest way to continue, that is just short castles, and now what is the problem? Here Daniel, if he goes rook h3, then g3, black's going to have time to go king to h8, then rook g8, defending g7 with the rook, and overall black is going to be doing just fine. And in fact, the computer says black here may even be doing a little bit better. Now, both sides do go for that line. Rook h3, king h8, rook g3, rook g8. Black is just in time to defend the checkmate threat on g7. Of course, white was literally threatening checkmate on g7, but again, black is defending here. All right, Daniel, how does he want to continue the attack? He goes queen to f4, sliding the queen over and pressuring that hanging pawn on f7. However, of course, black is to move and he has time to defend f7 with a few different moves. Now, right here, knight to f5 is the strongest line according to the computer. The point being, if white takes with the bishop, black can take back with the pawn. Instead of that, here, Magnus goes knight to c6. Now, this is a slightly dubious idea, but it does have a very strong threat. Here, if white takes on f7, black is going to go knight takes e5, winning that pawn, that pawn, sorry, and hitting the queen on f7. That would be very, very good for black. So instead here, white has to find something else. In the game, Daniel does go knight to f3, bringing the knight back to the f3 square. Keep in mind, it only went back to d2 because black took on d2 with the bishop. So knight takes d2, then jumping back to f3, and on f3, the knight does support that pawn on the e5 square. So very solid. Now Magnus, queen to e7 is the move, defending f7 with the queen, and now we have rook to e1. Sliding the rook over, but it turns out this move is maybe a little bit dubious. Instead, the computer likes the idea of c2 to c3 instead of rook to e1. The point being, you do stop the knight b4 threat from black, as c3 as the pawn on c3 would control the b4 square. Now, instead, rook to e1 played in the game, and here Magnus does go knight b4, hitting both the bishop, the pawn on c2, and finally the pawn on a2. Now, here Daniel, what is he going to do? He goes king g1, sliding his king over and ignoring the threat on the bishop. Now here, instead of taking on a2 or on d3, here Magnus just goes a4. The point being, he is threatening a takes b3, opening up the a file for his rook. He's trying to get some sort of counterplay on the queen side. Now here Daniel, he continues queen d2, sliding his queen back. It turns out this move is a little bit slow. Instead of that, the right way forward was knight to h2, intending knight g4. That would be the right way forward. Now, instead, in the game, queen d2 played by Daniel. Now we have a takes b3, a takes b3, and then finally rook to a2. Magnus sliding down with the rook, pressuring c2. Things are getting spicy on the queen side. Now here, Daniel, he should be thinking defense on the queen side. Rook c1 is the right way forward, but instead he goes knight to h2. Now, on the prior move, this was the right idea, but it turns out right here, this is a little bit of a mistake. Now here, Magnus, he just takes on d3, knight takes d3, queen takes d3, and then rook g to a8. The point being, with the queen no longer on the g4 square, pressuring g7, the rook on g8 is no longer needed, and it does slide over to the a file on a8. Now ideas like rook to a1 are in the air. We'll have to see what Magnus has in mind. All right, now it turns out the best way forward for Daniel is admitting that knight h2 was a mistake and heading back to the f3 square. Instead, Daniel, he doubles down on the wrong idea. He goes knight to g4, bring the knight to a more aggressive square, but it turns out, again, it should belong on f3, where it is a little more defensively placed. All right, now, Magnus, sure enough, rook to a1 is the move, threatening rook takes e1. Daniel will have to respond. In the game, he goes queen to c3, defending e1 and threatening a1. Therefore, rook takes e1 is virtually forced, and Magnus does go for it. So, rook takes e1, then queen takes e1, and then we have queen to h4. Magnus flying in with the queen, a very active move, putting pressure on the knight, the rook, and very importantly, the hanging pawn on h5. Daniel, will he defend that pawn? It turns out no, he will not. He slides his queen over, queen to c1. What is the idea behind this move? Well, it turns out here, white will have various sacrificial ideas based on knight takes h6 if Magnus is not careful. And it turns out here, he is not careful. The way you want to defend is king to h7. That would guard the h6 square with the king, but instead here, Magnus makes a critical mistake. He goes queen takes h5, gobbling up that free pawn, but again, this is a mistake. Now, if you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to figure out why this was a critical mistake by Magnus. And while you're at it, go and smash that YouTube like button for more videos just like this one. All right, here, the key idea for white, as promised, is knight takes h6, the temporary knight sacrifice. What is the idea? Well, it's very, very simple. If you take back with the queen, queen takes, then rook to h3, pins the queen to the king, and you win the queen. If you go instead, g takes h6, then again, rook to h3 is deadly, threatening rook takes h6, as again, the queen does also attack that square. And finally, if you go say king to h7, then knight g4 is very, very strong, retreating the knight and threatening rook to h3. Now, in the game, queen takes h6 was played, and now we have rook to h3 from Daniel, again, pinning that queen on h6 to the king on h8. Now we have queen takes and g takes, and here, Magnus, the GOAT, is officially down. The queen, Daniel has the queen versus the bishop and rook of black. And of course, the pawns are even, and that means Daniel has a massive material advantage in this endgame. All right, king g8, queen g5, activating the queen. Then we have c4, Magnus fighting for some counterplay on the queen side. Now queen to e7, then c takes b3, and c takes then bishop b5. Magnus getting the bishop out of the attack and trying to keep it active. Now we have queen b7, pressuring both the bishop and the queen, a very solid move. Now we have rook to a1, it hits the king, gets the rook out of the attack, king to h2, then bishop d3, finally defending that bishop. Now we have queen c8, hits the king, king h7, and here it turns out the best way to continue the initiative is queen to c3, hitting both the rook and the bishop on d3. Now, instead of that, queen c7 was played in the game, threatening that weak pawn on f7, but it turns out this was a critical mistake by Daniel. Now we have bishop g6, defending f7 with the bishop. Now b4, rook b1, getting the rook behind the passed pawn. Then queen to c3, flying down with the queen. Bishop f5, queen d4, g5. Magnus gaining some space on the king side. Very provocative. Maybe intending king to g6. Now we have queen c5, and sure enough, king g6 played in the game. Now b5, d4, b6. Here, Daniel is pushing his passed pawn down the board, but keep in mind, Magnus also has one, and he pushes his. So, d3, it is a race of the passed pawns here. Now we have queen d6, jumping up with the queen. d2, queen takes d2, and then rook takes b6. The two passed pawns are flying off the board. Now queen to d8, pressures the rook on b6, rook to b7, queen g8, king to h6, queen h8, king g6, queen to f6, king h5, and f3. Now we have rook d7, sliding the rook over, king to g3, rook b7, queen g7, rook d7, queen f8, king g6, queen g8, king h6, queen h8, king g6, and finally h4. Daniel trying to make something happen on the king side. Now we have g takes, king to f2, h3, king g3, trying to defend the passed pawn, but of course the bishop does control that pawn. Now we are going to fast forward a little bit until the game gets a little bit more exciting. Both sides going back and forth, Daniel trying his best to apply pressure on the king. We continue going here. Daniel again giving the king more and more checks. We're going to keep fast forwarding up until one side makes a mistake. So Daniel hits the king. The king moves. Queen to a2, king c3, queen a3. The king march continues. Daniel continues giving more and more checks against the king. The king hunt continues up until right here where Daniel makes a critical mistake. It turns out here queen to e7 was forced. Instead, queen to c8 played in the game. And believe it or not, this move is a critical mistake if Magnus finds the right continuation. And keep in mind, right here, Magnus has 3 seconds left on the clock versus the 2 seconds of Daniel. Anything can happen here. And here, the right move is rook to e2, intending h2, and the point being, with the rook on e2, queen to g8 is not a threat. If you go h2 right now, then queen to g8 does skewer the king and the rook on g2. Therefore, rook e2 does defend, threatens h2, h1, and so on. And that would be winning on the spot, as you can see by the eval bar on your left, totally collapsing. However, here, Magnus, he goes king g5. This is a mistake. Now here, the right move for white is king to e3, but instead Daniel queen g8 played in the game, skewering the king and the rook, but of course the rook is still defended. Now we have king to f4, queen h7, rook d2, hits the king, king c5, and here the right move is just taking the queen. Bishop takes h7, the queen is hanging, but Magnus, he misses it. He goes rook to g2. Was it a blunder? Did he miss bishop takes h7? Is he just playing with his food? What was the motivation? I don't know. All right, king to c6 played by Daniel. He ignores the attack on the queen. Now, of course, both sides are down to 2 seconds left. Is it a mistake? Is it time pressure or madness? I don't know. All right, king g3 played in the game. Queen to h6, king to f2, and here, queen to g5. Daniel putting his queen under the attack of the rook. What is the idea? Again, I don't know. Here, Magnus, he can just take the queen. Instead, king to g1 played in the game. Now we have queen f4, getting out of the attack. h2, queen e3, hits the king, king h1, queen e1, rook g1, queen c1. Daniel, he puts his queen under attack, queen to c1. The point being, he is down to 1 second. Magnus has less than 1 second left on the clock. I guess Daniel is just playing, playing chicken here, trying to force out a mistake in time trouble. Here, Magnus, he does not take the queen. He goes bishop to g4, pressuring the pawn. Now Daniel, queen c3, keeping the queen alive. Again, Magnus has less than 1 second. And here, the right move is anything but bishop takes f3, but that was played in the game, and it is a blunder. Bishop takes f3, and now here, queen takes f3 is winning for white, but instead, he goes king to c7, ignoring the bishop. All right, now rook g2 played, queen to c4, and in this position, Magnus Carlsen, he simply runs out of time on the clock, as you can see. And here, the game is over. My goodness, what a crazy game. I can't tell if these two were just messing with each other, making genuine mistakes in time trouble or something else. I mean, comment down below if you understand what the heck happened at the end of this game. Both sides missing such obvious moves. For example, heading back to this position right here, Magnus, instead of taking the queen, he goes for the move rook to g2. I don't know what to say about these moves right here. This game actually happened. It was a real game played on January 15, 2025 between Magnus and Daniel. So that's all I got, guys. Comment down below again if you understand what the heck happened, and smash that like button if you enjoyed this video. And while you're at it, go and check out this video right here where I cover yet another crazy game played between Daniel Naroditsky and Magnus Carlsen. So check that video out, and I'll see you in the next video.